Tobacco has been used by humans for millennia. Its origins as a cultivated plant trace back thousands of years to the Americas, where indigenous peoples grew and used it for spiritual ceremonies, medicinal purposes, and recreational enjoyment. Then, when European explorers first began bringing it back across the Atlantic from the 1500s and onwards, this marked the start of its far-reaching global influence on societies across the world. Now, initially, tobacco was a luxury product in Europe, embraced by the wealthy and celebrated for its supposed health benefits. So, doctors back then praised it as a cure-all for a number of ailments ranging from headaches to the Black Plague. The corresponding increase in demand made tobacco cultivation, particularly in colonies like Virginia, economically crucial in the broader global trade system. Unfortunately, however, this was all built on the exploitation of slave labor, a deeply immoral and ultimately unsustainable source of the crop. Either way, by the 1800s, tobacco was no longer a luxury reserved for the elite. Advances in farming and production methods, as well as improved global transportation, made it more accessible to the masses. Smoking went from a rare indulgence to a widespread habit. This era also saw the birth of the industrial cigarette, which radically transformed how tobacco was consumed. Instead of rolling their own, people could now buy pre-rolled cigarettes, easy, cheap, and widely available. This convenience only made tobacco's hold on people and society that much stronger. However, as its use spread, so too did its darker side. Reports of health complications, from chronic coughing to the mysterious smoker's lung, began emerging. Still, these concerns were often drowned out by aggressive marketing campaigns from powerful tobacco companies. In the 1800s and early 1900s, smoking was romanticized in ads, movies, and public culture. The cigarette became an icon of sophistication, masculinity, and even rebellion. And then women, once excluded from the tobacco market, were also targeted, with ads linking smoking to liberation and modernity. And then, finally, after the mid-1900s, things started to change. As scientific research advanced, the impact of tobacco on human health became increasingly clear. Important studies in the 1950s and 60s started linking smoking to lung cancer, heart disease, and a whole host of other serious illnesses. Public health campaigns soon followed, trying to raise awareness about the dangers of tobacco. Yet, even in the face of this sort of damning evidence, the tobacco industry fought back, investing millions into disinformation campaigns, lobbying efforts, and pseudoscientific studies designed to sow doubt and delay regulation. Despite these efforts, the tide of public opinion eventually began to shift. By the end of the 1900s, many governments around the world introduced strict measures to curb tobacco use, including warning labels, advertising bans, and public smoking restrictions. These regulations were further strengthened by a growing understanding of nicotine's addictive properties and the devastating effects of secondhand smoke. Once seen as a harmless pleasure or a social rite, smoking became increasingly stigmatized, a habit to quit rather than one to celebrate. Therefore, today, in many parts of the world, smoking is far more regulated than it once was. Taxes on tobacco products have risen sharply, funding public health initiatives and discouraging consumption. Anti-smoking campaigns have educated millions on the risks, while cessation programs have offered support to those trying to quit. In many countries, as a result of these changes, smoking rates have plummeted, and tobacco's stranglehold on public life has weakened significantly in a way that would have been near on unimaginable just a few decades ago. Now, this is only true in some countries, as Big Tobacco has increasingly and aggressively focused its efforts on countries with less regulation. But no matter how we look at it, the success of anti-tobacco measures in many countries is testament to the possibility of regulation to break the grip of a societal phenomenon that's both deeply addictive and backed up by immense corporate power. If nothing else, this proves that it is possible, with the appropriate effort, to push back against tendencies in society that from the beginning may seem so pervasive and ubiquitous that we might not even initially be able to imagine a world without them. And that, of course, leads us into the topic of today, the addictive nature and economic stranglehold of big tech, in particular through the internet, social media, and smartphones. In the previous video, we already discussed the general ways in which big data can manipulate people, so in this video, the sixth and final of this series, we'll turn to look in particular at the addictive nature of these digital technologies by focusing on so-called dark patterns. So, what is a dark pattern? Well, the term refers to features in the design of websites, apps, or digital services that are deliberately engineered to manipulate users into doing things they might not otherwise choose to do. This could include actions like spending more time on a platform, making purchases they wouldn't otherwise have made, or giving up more personal data than they'd prefer. Basically, dark patterns exploit psychological principles and cognitive biases to benefit the designer's goals, which are typically financial, and all this is done at the expense of the user. The term itself was coined by UX designer Harry Brignall in 2010, and it, as well as its synonym deceptive patterns, have since become central concepts in discussions about the ethics of user experience design. While many people acknowledge that all design inherently nudges people's behavior, dark patterns are generally thought to cross an ethical line by intentionally creating confusion or taking advantage of users' mental shortcuts. So, the sorts of cognitive bandwidth and other hardwired neural limitations we've already discussed in previous videos. And when wielded by big tech companies with immense resources and cutting-edge technology, dark patterns become not just manipulative, but potentially dystopian. So, as to the specific mechanics, there are many different sorts of identified dark patterns, but they generally share a common thread. That is, they're subtle enough to avoid detection by the average user, but effective enough to drive significant results at scale. Exactly what counts as a dark pattern differs between different taxonomies, but some common types include the following. Obstruction. This involves deliberately making it difficult for users to achieve a certain action, such as unsubscribing from a service. Think of those unnecessarily complicated processes where you have to click through multiple pages, confirm via email, and answer "Are you sure?" pop-ups just to cancel a subscription. This technique builds on user exhaustion, with the company using it knowing full well that many people will give up halfway through the process. Forced action. This type of dark pattern requires users to take an action they don't want to in order to proceed with something they do want. For example, many free apps will insist you allow data collection, turn on notifications, or share your contacts as a condition for using the service, even if none of these are essential for the actual service itself. Hidden costs. These are extra fees or conditions that are only revealed late in a process, such as during checkout. While common in e-commerce, the principle is migrated into subscription models and even so-called freemium apps, where hidden charges emerge only after users are locked in. Fake urgency. Many sites use fake urgency signals like countdown timers or limited stock notifications in order to pressure users into quick decisions. Sometimes these claims are completely fabricated, designed to do nothing other than stoke your fear of missing out, or FOMO. Privacy zuckering. Named after Mark Zuckerberg, this refers to tricking users into sharing more personal data than what they actually intended to. Complex privacy settings and pre-ticked consent boxes are classic examples of this pattern. Now, chances are you recognize many of these from your own online dealings. In fact, most of them predate the internet per se, such as old physical newspaper subscriptions being exceedingly difficult to cancel, with something nearing harassment in how insistent their sellers would be post-cancellation in calling you up again and again to offer you special deals to restart your subscription. But a crucial difference between these sorts of analog dark patterns and their digital equivalents is that the digital variants can be tweaked to utter perfection, both on the general population as a whole, but also on you personally as a conveniently quantified member of some specific category of user. And artificial intelligence, or AI, through its reliance on the sorts of machine learning algorithms we discussed in the previous video, makes this optimization even more powerful. Basically, as AI has matured, the sophistication of dark patterns has increased dramatically. Where early patterns were designed by human intuition and A/B split testing, today's strategies are guided by AI systems capable of processing vast amounts of behavioral data. These systems learn not just what works, but how to tailor manipulations to individual users. For instance, an AI system might notice that you tend to abandon your cart when shipping fees are high, but follow through when you're offered a small discount. The next time you visit, you might be targeted with a pop-up promising free shipping, but only if you agree to additional terms, like signing up for a newsletter or sharing more personal data. AI turbocharges this process, allowing companies to micro-target millions of users with bespoke manipulations, and it's been going on for years, most notably in interfaces such as King Digital's Candy Crush Saga, an enormous real-world profit-driven psychology experiment aimed at seeing which specific design elements and nudges are required to fully maximize the addictive and monetizable impact of an interface posing as a casual and silly game. And it worked. At their peak, around 2014, King Digital made almost $500 million over a 3-month period off the game, a financial testament to its addictive success. Now, in case it's not already entirely obvious, dark patterns have become a particularly insidious threat to personal privacy. As I've indicated already, big tech companies have learned that making privacy protective options difficult to access or downright incomprehensible can ensure more widespread compliance with their data gathering goals. So basically, the more they learn about you, the more they can predict and control your real-world behavior. And the more they can predict and control your real-world behavior, the more difficult they can make it for you to opt out from them learning everything they want about you. In a sense, this is many times quite similar to gambling psychology. Both the gambling industry and big tech exploit the same fundamental principles of human psychology, such as the power of what's called intermittent rewards and loss aversion. So, for example, a casino will carefully design its layout to keep gamblers playing, like by hiding all clocks to make it more difficult to keep track of time, or making sure that some slot machine loudly wins just often enough to maximize the chance that you and everybody else keep playing on your own machines, thinking your big win is just around the corner. Likewise, social media platforms deploy tricks like infinite scrolling and pull to refresh interfaces to keep users engaged. Both rely on a cycle of dopamine hits where small, unpredictable rewards, like a new like on a post of yours, keep users coming back for more. And where the comparison becomes particularly chilling is in the vast scale of big tech. So, gambling establishments are geographically confined and legally restricted to certain ages. This way, they can only reach so many people. Big tech, by contrast, operates globally, with billions of users interacting with their platforms every day. And although they may have age limits, everybody knows it's trivial to circumvent these, meaning billions of children around the world engage with them on a daily basis. Moreover, while gambling addiction is well documented and increasingly regulated, the addictive mechanisms deployed by big tech are only really beginning to be discussed. This is particularly troubling when we think of dark patterns and their disproportionate effects on vulnerable populations. People with low digital literacy, for example, are much more likely to fall for manipulative design elements. Similarly, and as I already noted, children are both particularly susceptible to persuasive interfaces and are frequently, if implicitly, targeted with dark patterns in apps and games, such as loot boxes or in-app purchases disguised as essential progress. And as if this isn't bad enough, AI-driven dark patterns then exacerbate the issue by targeting these vulnerabilities at scale. So, for example, a machine learning algorithm might identify users who are emotionally distressed based on their browsing behavior and then push them toward purchases or extended engagement, much in the same way that the gambling industry knowingly targets players who are more likely to get hooked and lose significant amounts of money. At the heart of all these issues lies a really fundamental ethical question. Should companies have the right to exploit behavioral tendencies for profit? As we discussed in the previous video, some argue that consumers are responsible for their own choices. But as we already talked about there, and as my examples of tobacco and gambling hopefully provide reasonably clear counterexamples to, this sort of perspective ignores the imbalance of power between corporations and individuals. Big tech companies possess a level of behavioral insight and influence that few individuals can resist, let alone understand. In fact, if we zoom out for a moment to take a broader perspective, the impact of technology on privacy today is actually quite different from what it used to be. As we discussed in the first two videos, Warren and Brandeis's concerns about Kodak camera snapshots threatening to reveal people's personal secrets, or the Supreme Court arguing in favor of a couple's right to make certain important life decisions, or various post-mid-century warnings about government surveillance of its own people, all of these related in various ways to the technological developments of the day. But they were still mostly concerned with what the technologies might reveal about you specifically to others, in a way that we might all feel was deeply uncomfortable. With dark patterns, this concern doesn't really exist anymore. You see, the fact is, big tech corporations don't really give, to use the technical term, a rat's ass about you as an individual or any of your possible secrets. They're not generally trying to make you more amenable to their bidding by threatening to reveal embarrassing information that you don't want them to or similar. Instead, to them, you are entirely uninteresting as a person. In fact, at the end of the day, all you really are is a variably monetizable unit. You are, to put it simply, fuel for their gigantic financial furnace, which they found a way of reusing again and again for their purposes. Phrased in terms of deontological or Kantian ethics, they treat you not as an end in itself, but as a means to an end, increased profit or a certain political outcome or whatever else they happen to be interested in pursuing. This is the reality of technology and its impact on privacy today. And this shift from personal secrets to you being just another monetizable but ultimately replaceable financial gain unit explains to a large extent why so many people don't seem to care so much about their privacy today, what's often referred to as the privacy paradox. If you've ever felt a twinge of guilt about how casually you accept some sites or apps' terms and conditions, knowing full well that you're giving away much more than you'd like to, but then doing it anyway, well, then you've encountered the so-called privacy paradox. Specifically, the term describes the apparent contradiction between people's stated concerns about privacy and their actual behavior. Surveys routinely show that most people say that they care deeply about protecting their personal information, and yet, in practice, they then engage in behaviors that compromise their privacy, whether this is oversharing on social media, downloading apps without reviewing their permissions, or clicking accept all on cookie consent pop-ups without a second thought. This disconnect, or apparent paradox, has puzzled researchers for a long time. If people value privacy as much as they claim, why don't their actions align with their words? Is it hypocrisy, apathy, or something else entirely? To understand this, we need to unpack some of the relevant empirical research into the paradox. So, one common explanation for the privacy paradox is that people are simply uninformed about what they're agreeing to. Like we discussed in the previous video, study after study show that privacy policies and terms and conditions are often written in complex legal jargon, making them inaccessible to most users. Unsurprisingly then, most users don't even try, skipping over the text entirely and blindly clicking accept. But a lack of information is only part of the picture. Even when users are informed about privacy risks, their behavior often doesn't change. A series of studies suggests that when participants are explicitly told about potential data misuse, many still choose to disclose personal information in exchange for minor benefits like small discounts or rewards points. This finding has been replicated many times in many variants, thus suggesting that users' choices are shaped by immediate incentives rather than long-term risks. In fact, the effects go even further than this. Some studies show that many individuals who claim to be more concerned about their privacy than the average user still tend to share just as much personal information. Likewise, other studies show that people generally don't want to pay much at all to protect their privacy when this is offered as a sort of perk to default but free settings that are openly privacy invasive. Similarly, not only do people prefer not to pay for their privacy, when the settings are flipped and they're offered money for divulging more personal information, they seem to be willing to let that information go for a very cheap price. In other words, whatever people say, we all just don't seem to actually care about our privacy as much as we might say that we do. And to be frank, I fit into this category perfectly well myself. Despite having studied the law and ethics of privacy for more than 1.5 decades, I still tend to do like most everybody else. I have a smartphone with all sorts of stupid, entertaining, but both privacy invasive and honestly useless apps installed. I accept the T&Cs without even trying to pretend I'm going to read through them. If there isn't a reject all button available on the first cookie consent pop-up, I'll typically just go for accept all, instead of the hassle of multi-clicking my way to actually rejecting cookie consent, thereby knowingly allowing myself to become a victim of the dark pattern of obstruction, basically every single time. So, if anything, I probably come across as the ultimate poster boy for the privacy paradox. I mean, here I am recording hours of video lecture content on privacy and the way it's threatened by digital technology and society today, only to ultimately not practice what I'm actually preaching. How's that for hypocrisy? But what if it's not? What if the gap between people's concerns and their behavior isn't a paradox at all, but something else entirely? That's the argument put forward by Ignacio Cofone in his recent book, The Privacy Fallacy: Harm and Power in the Information Economy. Cofone's central claim is that the privacy paradox isn't a paradox at all. Instead, he argues, it's mostly just the product of uncertainty, that we can't really know what sorts of risks of future harm we might be agreeing to by clicking on accept all. In his book, he gives a nice comparison of opening up a vegan donut shop. If you, as the donut shop owner, don't know whether or not the shop will become a massive success or fail miserably, well, then it makes perfect rational sense to start out by only investing in cheap furniture and equipment. Yes, this might be more expensive in the long term than just buying higher quality items right from the start, but given the risk that you could go out of business as soon as your initial personal investment runs out, that's a rational and calculated risk. And really, the cheap furniture will work just fine until the shop is established enough that you know it's worth upgrading to the higher quality stuff. And in exactly the same way, argues Cofone, it makes perfect rational sense to not value our privacy particularly highly when we don't really know, or can't see, what the harms of sharing it might actually be. In fact, as we already discussed in the last video, oftentimes the big tech companies themselves don't even know all the potential risks and benefits that might arise out of your data, like using it to train future generation AI models. Essentially, nobody knows, which makes it entirely unsurprising that people have a hard time seeing much value in keeping their personal data exhaust from being collected, stored, processed, and used to infer things about them. And this effect that nobody can really accurately predict the future risks of harm from agreeing to yet another privacy policy without hesitation, it's also further strengthened by the aforementioned AI and machine learning algorithmic tendency to keep people reasonably comfortable with their online activities. So, for instance, it's well known that people get creeped out when their ads seem to know them a little too well, like your grocery store knowing exactly when during your menstrual cycle to send you a coupon for its feminine hygiene products. How do they deal with this? Well, one common strategy is to purposely incorporate a sufficient amount of seemingly random ads for things that have nothing to do with you, like maybe a beer helmet or whatever, to make you feel like the feminine hygiene products and other things are just lucky accidents that happen to hit just when you need them instead of actually being targeted directly at you, as they are. In fact, one relevant critique of a lot of the original privacy paradox studies is that they don't remove the uncertainty faced by users. If it spelled out exactly what the very real and concrete risks of something are, then the so-called paradox tends to evaporate. And we mostly all know this already intuitively. I may not know how my personal data exhaust, my taps and clicks, my gyrometer and battery and GPS data, and so on, how all this might contribute to any particular concrete future risk of harm. But I do know that I, like almost everybody else, don't want other people knowing all of my medical history. And in studies where the risks are made this concrete, so something like that by clicking accept all, you thereby acknowledge that all your contacts will get copies of your entire medical history, well, those studies show that all of a sudden people will charge a very high price for their privacy, or conversely pay much more to protect it. Basically, once the risks are more tangibly real, there doesn't seem to be much of any privacy paradox. So it's no wonder in the current digital systems that we don't worry more. After all, most of us, including to some extent the companies themselves, have no idea just how valuable all this personal data might eventually actually wind up being. That is, Facebook and Google and others don't actually know just how bright you, as a monetizable data unit, how bright you will burn when they toss you into their financial furnace. But so far, everything points to that more data equals more value, so they have every incentive to keep hoovering up as much as they absolutely can and keeping you addicted enough to maximize a steady flow of personal information. But perhaps there's another reason we don't worry. Perhaps things aren't actually that bad. Okay, medical records shouldn't be shared, but the taps and clicks and perhaps even the inference of your personality and intelligence and sexuality and all that other stuff, maybe it's not actually bad as I've made it out to be. Maybe we just shouldn't be so pessimistic about things. Perhaps it'll all work out fine in the end. I mean, nobody really knows the ultimate answer to this, where it'll all wind up in the future. But we certainly can make some educated guesses, which can help us to start make reasonable sense of the societal phenomenon of digital platforms as they are today. And one highly relevant way of doing so is by looking at some of their current systemic impacts. What sorts of effects are we actually seeing in the real world already now, and what might these tell us about the ultimate risks we could be facing the more digital we go? So, as we've already established, the potential negative impact of contemporary digital technology is less about you as an individual and your particular personality quirks and secrets and so on, and more about you as one variably monetizable unit among millions or billions of others. Your value to big tech lies not in any of what they can ultimately discover or infer about specifically you. No, your value lies in their capacity to predictably steer your and billions of other users' real-world behavior at scale. Because this is how they then manage to sell everybody's micro-categorized personal profiles to various advertisers and influence conglomerates and similar. I mentioned in the previous video that Neil Richards, in his book Why Privacy Matters, compares the current state of big tech with the unsafe and polluting factories of the early pre-regulation age of industrialization. Basically, workers, including little children, would frequently lose life and limb operating enormous unsafe machinery. And, to take Richards' metaphor even further, even if you as an individual happened to disapprove of industrialization and made sure to neither work within its factories nor support its growth through your consumption, even then you would still still be affected by it. Because of factories polluting the air with noxious gases and the water with various chemicals, and because the need for labor brought huge demographic shifts, with thousands of people from villages and the countryside descending onto the cities to live in squalor and cramped slums. In other words, nobody, no matter where they lived, could escape from the pervasive effects of industrialization, whether or not they themselves participated in it. And, to be frank, we see the same sort of thing with addictive digital technology today. We see people being exploited and killed, and we see an impact that stretches far beyond what any one of us individually could ever hope to meaningfully consent to, and which affects us all, regardless if we participate in any of the platforms or not. So let's take these concerns one at a time, starting with the people directly exploited and killed by big tech. The first group to mention in all this is so-called content moderators. These are workers, mostly based in poor countries with laxer labor laws, who are tasked with filtering out the most horrifying material from our online feeds. So we're talking about things like hate speech, videos of real torture and rape and beheadings and so on, child pornography, and other similar forms of deeply traumatic content. You might never have thought about it while you're scrolling through your Facebook feed, but part of the reason it's not overrun with this sort of content is largely thanks to content moderators. They're essentially the people on the front line keeping the rest of us safe from the nastiest and most depraved tendencies of humankind, of which there turns out to be a lot more than many of us might think. And for content moderators, the work is absolutely grueling. We know from numerous eyewitness reports, and despite big tech trying to silence them with various non-disclosure agreements and threats of litigation and similar, we know that content moderators are subjected to a relentless stream of psychologically damaging material, often with woefully inadequate mental health support. We also know that long-term and repeated exposure to this content leads, for some, to symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, as well as depression, anxiety, panic attacks, radicalization, suicide, and so on. On top of all this, many of the moderators are paid extremely low wages, far less than what similar roles would demand in wealthier countries. So, essentially, the sanitized versions of social media that most of us are familiar with are like old industrial products. They may look nice and clean when we consume them, but their production process has contributed to a lot of harm and exploitation in the world, which is kept largely invisible to us, the end consumers. I should perhaps mention that this sort of job also exists in less legitimate business contexts. So, for instance, some of the digital organized crime syndicates I mentioned a few videos back specialize in various scams, including pig butchering. This gruesome name is used as a moniker for a specific form of romantic scam, where individuals in richer countries are targeted and made to predictably fall in love with a fake online persona, actually run by the crime syndicate, following a point-by-point script. Basically, they get the victim to invest emotionally, referred to as fattening up the pig, until the moment they manufacture a phony emergency or similar to try to extract money from them in various ways. And more often than not, it works. And not only that, but unfortunately, much like with content moderators, even the workers doing the pig butchering tend to be exploited themselves. In fact, various reports suggest that many of the people running the scams are actually trafficked individuals who are forced to work grueling hours in slave-like conditions, held captive by the criminal syndicates until they've repaid some fabricated crushing debt. So, Richard's industrialization analogy certainly holds in terms of laborers being exploited to manufacture the products of digitalization. And although content moderation and pig butchering might not seem to be directly connected to privacy as such, they're actually all interconnected in various ways, such as social media depending on your continued engagement in order to monetize you, meaning they need to know enough about you to be able to feed you the sort of material that you react to without scaring you away with the sort of material that would leave you feeling traumatized and less likely to return. So exactly the sort of thing the content moderators get exposed to instead, in your place. Or the fact that once we've collected and processed and analyzed the data of a sufficient number of individuals, the script for getting others to fall in love is depressingly predictable and repeatable. It's sort of like The Tinder Swindler, the Netflix documentary about an individual who scammed several women out of their life savings by pretending to be in love with them, only run at a massively industrial scale. But it's not just hidden exploited labor. There are plenty of direct victims of the AI-driven addictive platforms among consumers, too. So recall, algorithms are at the heart of how all modern digital platforms function, deciding what content users see and when. And although they might at first appear neutral or even benevolent, in reality, these algorithms both reinforce various biases, as we discussed a few videos ago, and ultimately tend to prioritize engagement above all else, including user safety. Remember, only by getting you to stick around as long as possible can the platforms collect as much of your personal data as they want. And this prioritization, engagement over everything else, has had tragic consequences, particularly for children and adolescents. This is Nyla Anderson. She died when she was 10 years old, taking part in the Blackout Challenge that went viral a few years back on TikTok. Specifically, TikTok had pushed Blackout Challenge-related content to her on her For You feed. This content showed kids and teenagers self-asphyxiating with a belt or rope or similar, and then experiencing what looks like an exciting rush when they would come to. Being 10, Nyla attempted this with a purse strap when she was alone in her room until her mother found her shortly after, hanging by the neck in her bedroom closet. She was rushed to hospital but died 5 days later. And unfortunately, Nyla isn't the only one. There are scores upon scores of children, teenagers, and even adults who have died because of various social media trends, ranging from harmful eating challenges to graphic self-harm content. The root of the problem here lies in the way the algorithms function. Specifically, they learn from user data to predict and prioritize what will keep you engaged. And unfortunately, content that triggers strong emotional reactions like fear, shock, and outrage often outperforms less provocative material. For children who lack the developmental maturity to navigate these trends in any meaningful way, the consequences can be devastating. And as I said already before, yes, formally, Nyla should not have been on TikTok as she was under the platform's minimum age of 13. But as I'm sure all of you already likely know, circumventing this sort of age limit is not only trivial, it's also what actually happens all the time, all around the world. Now, I should mention here that this is not just a TikTok problem, just so nobody mistakenly draws any such faulty conclusion. In fact, the amount of news stories you may have seen about the dangers of TikTok are perhaps true in some cases, but many of them were also planted by lobbying groups paid by Facebook to spread fear and doubt about this new social media challenger. The lobbyists rather successfully inundated traditional news media with stories about dangerous TikTok trends and so on, despite the fact that many of them originated from, or like the Blackout Challenge, were also widespread on Facebook. So don't think this is unique to TikTok. Or, in other words, even if one platform would manage to come up with a way to take seriously their formal commitment to ban children, then the children would just pick up the same trend from some other platform with more lax age regulation. So again, like in the case of industrialization, the general impact of addictive digital technology on society is one that benefits some, harms others, and kills a few outright. And we know by now that many of these effects are quite pervasive. For instance, numerous studies now show that teenage girls are particularly vulnerable to the ill effects of social media, running especially heightened risks of developing eating disorders, self-harm behaviors, depression, suicide, and so on, in correlation with the extent of their social media use. In fact, internal documents from Facebook have revealed that the company has known full well just how negative an impact it has had on teen mental health, and yet it's kept largely quiet about this. But so far, all I've talked about now is laborers and consumers of social media and other digital platforms. The original industrialization metaphor I started with made the point that everybody was affected by industrialization, even if they lived a cozy life in a manor somewhere far away from the factories themselves. But does digitalization really do this as well? That is, does it impact everyone, including the privacy nuts who refuse to use any social media or smartphones or similar? Actually, as a matter of fact, and perhaps not surprisingly, it does. The internet has become so embedded in daily life that opting out is becoming, in many places, increasingly impossible. Today, in many countries, tasks as basic as banking, paying bills, or applying for jobs all require online interactions, typically facilitated by social media platforms or done on smartphone apps. Likewise, healthcare is increasingly shifting toward telemedicine and online appointment systems, while education increasingly relies on digital classrooms and resources, such as this series of videos. In fact, it's gone so far that in a highly digitalized country like Sweden, for those who choose or are forced by circumstances to live offline, well, they tend to find themselves excluded from various critical services, unable to participate fully in society. Basically, you just can't live a normal functioning life without going online. And although in principle going online doesn't need to entail giving away your personal information to all sorts of questionable organizations, in practice today it does. It's near impossible to do anything, such as watching this series of videos on YouTube, without it contributing to your personal data profile in a way that can then be monetized and weaponized to get you to buy something or vote for someone or whatever. Actually, on that last point, let's turn to perhaps the most relevant example, democracy. So imagine a hypothetical individual who neither works for nor uses any social media or smartphone or similar. Surely, insofar as they actively opt out, even if it's a bit tricky, in the end they have nothing to complain about, right? Well, sadly, no, democracy proves a relevant counterexample to this. Regardless how you may vote in some election, social media and smartphone communication apps like WhatsApp have had a measurably significant impact on voting patterns across countries. That is, even if you live your life 100% offline, your political and societal reality is still being affected by digital platforms. So basically, just like industrialization, there's no escaping the systemic impacts of digitalization. Which leads to the fundamental question, what do we do now? There's been a big push in recent years towards so-called digital minimalism, the idea that you can choose which digital tools to engage with and which ones to avoid as a sort of mindful approach to platform overwhelm. And although a lot of these ideas might be good and perhaps come from the right place, they generally tend to misunderstand the nature of the platform's harms. Much like privacy policies and terms and conditions, they mistakenly think the issue is all about personal choice. You can choose for yourself whether or not to partake in the digital game. But as I've just described, this gets two things wrong. First, like tobacco, these technologies are designed to be addictive. They take advantage of various quirks of human neuropsychology in a way that makes them, like cigarettes, exceedingly difficult to break free from when just left to the individual. Second, the actual impacts of these technologies on the world are, in fact, not just on individuals, but far more systemic. That is, like factory pollution or secondhand smoke, they will affect you, even if you choose not to partake at all. And we know throughout history that tackling big systemic issues requires big systemic changes, with most meaningful long-term improvement coming through legal regulation. We've talked about some of this, such as the EU's GDPR or their new AI Act, which is coming into force bit by bit at this very moment. In fact, the Act will entail a complete ban on some particularly problematic uses of AI, such as for social credit scoring, memorably portrayed in the Black Mirror episode Nosedive. But make no mistake, big tech, regardless what they themselves may claim, is fighting any meaningful regulation tooth and nail. And this makes sense. We know from various other fields such as tobacco and prescription opioids that regulation tends to develop in a relatively predictable manner, moving from initial market expansion to growing evidence of harm, which is in turn always met with corporate resistance, where the companies with most at stake deploy their considerable resources to obstruct regulation. But when we push through with meaningful regulation anyway, well, then the companies adapt. And although they may not be as insanely profitable as they could have been without regulation, society is all the better for it. So right now we're at a crucial crossroads. I predict it's just a few years before we have far stricter and more meaningful regulation. But the question is, how many lives need to be exploited and shattered and ended prematurely before this happens? Like with tobacco, how many more people need to suffer the harms before we actually do something about it? After all, the sooner we contribute to ending the worst excesses of big tech, the personal data sniffing perversions of surveillance capitalists, the better for all of us, our families, our friends, and our future children and grandchildren. And I know it can sometimes feel bleak, but I think the tobacco example I began with should give us hope. When I was born, in the early 1980s, very few people could have predicted that in many countries we were just a few decades away from breaking the stranglehold of big tobacco on society. In other words, we know the playbook. We know what needs to come next to curb the more extreme harms of big tech. Now, in this series of videos, we've considered privacy from various angles, looking at its historical origins and conceptual definitions, its intersection with information security, and how it relates to autonomy, including through addictive dark patterns. But in the end, here's where we end up. The absolutely best thing you can do for privacy at this moment, in the sort of world we actually happen to live in, is to work hard to bring more regulation into the tech sector as regards any service or platform that trades in personal information. or at least to advocate for less intense processing of personal information and less dark pattern reliant addictive interfaces. And I know this is a big task that'll likely take years and the collaborative effort of millions of individuals, but at least the GDPR and similar legislation, for all their flaws, constitute a very important first step in the right direction. And at a more personal level, in the meantime, I recommend you think about how you, as somebody who now knows far more about these issues than most other people in society, how you might be able to at least occasionally pause the addictive stranglehold of these technologies. So, in that vein, I'd encourage you to unplug, switch off, leave your phone at home, and go spend some time face to face with the people you love. So, instead of seeing you in the next video, who knows, perhaps I'll see you in real life.